Okay, let's start this video off by comparing the regular Orc stat block and the Orog stat block. At first glance, they're literally the same creature. The Orog has higher stats and plate armor. Oh, I'm sorry, they also have multi-attack and intimidation proficiency. That's so representational of the Orcs of the Underdark, and it definitely shows and represents that they absolutely cannot stand sunlight, right? Oh, and that they're martial masters and intelligent blacksmiths. Okay. So you see my issue, right? If you've never read the lore for the Orog, where is its Underdark representation in its stat block? Nowhere. That's where. I want to dive into the 2014 Monster Manual lore and then show you what I've done with my own iteration of the Orogs. Yes, I know, the time of Orc is now, the time of man has passed, but before we get into world domination, we have to look at the 2014 Monster Manual, page 245, Orog. Orogs are orcs blessed with a surprisingly keen intellect that ordinary orcs believe is a gift from the orc goddess Luthik. Like Luthik, Orogs prefer to live underground, although the scarcity of food often brings them to the surface to hunt. Orcs represent an Orog's strength and cunning, and a lone Orog might find and command an orc warband. They are stronger and smarter. An Orog uses its strength to bully other orcs and its intelligence to surprise enemies on the battlefield. Many an overconfident elf, human, or dwarf commander has watched a simple orc warlord execute a clever maneuver to outflank and destroy an opposing force, not realizing that the orc was an Orog. When encountered in great numbers, Orogs form their own detachments with much larger orc hordes, and they are always at the forefront of any attack, relying on their superior strength and tactical insight to overcome anything that stands in their way. Few orc tribes actively seek out Orogs to bolster their ranks. The Orog's superiority makes them ideal leaders, and thus deadly rivals to orc war chiefs, who must be wary of Orog treachery. They are detached killers, wanting nothing more than to hack their enemies to pieces. Orogs are a terrifying presence on the battlefield. They form no attachments, even to their parents and siblings, and have no concept of love or dedication. They worship the orc pantheon of gods, Grumsh and Luthik foremost, because they believe that the gods have strength beyond reason, and physical might is all they respect. They are servants of darkness. Mistrusted by orcs, some Orogs form independent mercenary warbands that sell themselves to the highest bidder. As long as they are rewarded, Orog mercenaries gladly serve as elite warriors and shock troops for evil wizards, depraved giants, and other villains. So as young DM Dungeon Mastery would say, with all of this in mind, let's take a look at the 2014 Orog stat block and break down my issues with it. Now, before I get into this, I just want to state that I am in no way claiming to be better than Wizards of the Coast. I'm not claiming to be the best creature stat block maker on YouTube. I'm just showing you my own ideas. So if you disagree with them, please leave me constructive criticism in the comments. I'm all for it. Let's get into it, shall we? Alright, this is a 9-year-old stat block at this point, so, I'm not going to kick it too hard while it's down, but we already went over this sort of in the intro, so I just want to kind of briefly glance over it, kind of give you my opinions on it. So, Orogs are chaotic evil, which I agree with. They are from an evil god and pantheon, so they should be chaotic evil, or at least some form of evil, in my opinion. But you can always make them typically chaotic evil. They do wear plate armor, and that is to represent that they are blacksmiths and they can smith their own armor. So if you have Orogs that are following an orc warband, that orc warband is probably going to get kitted out with better gear than, your average orc with their raided and plundered weapons. Very similar to frost giants and fire giants in a way. Their hit points are much beefier than a regular orc, coming in at 42. That's a lot for a horde enemy. You know, these guys are going to take a couple hits before they go down, and they have decently high armor class, so they're going to put up way more of a fight than a normal orc. Their ability scores are good. I like their ability scores. I don't think the HP, the speed, or the ability scores need to change at all on any variation of an Orog that you make. They do have an intimidation skill, which is sort of representative of them bullying the other orcs, like it's said in their lore. They have a dark vision. I would hope they have dark vision if they live in the Underdark. They speak Common and Orc, which is fine. They have a CR of 2, and that is because they are lacking pretty much anything else on the stat block. So they have Aggressive, which is a classic Orc trait. They can take the dash action as long as they're moving towards a hostile creature that they can see. It's pretty good. They have a lot of mobility from that. Now, the actions is where I always lament to all of you about. This is where the creature gets kind of one-dimensional. Now, 2 Great Axe attacks, that's a lot of damage. That's 2d12 plus 8 if it hits with both Great Axe attacks. But I think being that these are martial creatures, they're creatures that train militaristically, they should have something more that they can do. And of course, this singular stat block is all we're provided, so we don't know what other Orogs do, so I took the liberty of making my own interpretation of what Orogs could represent in the Underdark, and I like the fact that they are from the Underdark. I think that is unique about them, that separates them from all of the other orcs, and I like the Underdark personally. It's a really cool place to run your adventures. They also do have a javelin, which they can only throw 1 of instead of being able to throw 2, and it does way less damage than the Great Axe, so they want to be in melee. So let's jump into mine. I gave you guys quite a few Orogs to work with. However, starting now, if you subscribe to my Patreon, the lowest tier that I have, the $3 tier, you gain access to extra Patreon exclusive stat blocks now. With every upcoming video release, I will be making unique stat blocks that are kind of just bonuses and a thank you for subscribing to my Patreon channel. Of course, you don't have to do this. This is just me thanking you for supporting me. So let's get into it without further ado. So another thing before I get into this Orog Warrior, I did make an Orog Commoner. It's not going to be featured in the video, but it'll be on the Discord for free. Link in the description if you want to get into the Discord and download all these creature stat blocks for free. I figured most people don't want to see a commoner, they want to see the meat and potatoes of these creature reworks, so it's there in case you want it for a low level party to fight against. But I'm going to start off with the Orog Warrior. So what you're going to see with these Orog stat blocks is the hit points, the speed, the ability scores are mostly going to remain the same, except for maybe 1 or 2 of them have slightly different stats. But I wanted those to stay the same because I want these to just be variations on the Orog that we see in the monster manual, which, might I add, they don't use Great Axes, Wizards of the Coast. You even have in their lore that they use great swords and throwing axes. So that's a big change that you're going to see with mine. But let's look at the saving throw proficiencies really quick. I did give them a strength saving throw proficiency, so the average Orog Warrior has a strength saving throw proficiency now, which I think is befitting. They are warring martial, not masters, but they are warring martial creatures. They should have a proficiency in strength. Now, I also gave them a religion skill proficiency, and that is because Luthic, which is the god they worship, one of the gods they worship, drove them to live underground because they preferred to live like she does. So it would make sense, I think, that they would have a religion proficiency because of that. Religion is an important part of an orc's life, pretty much. So the only special trait on the basic Orog Warrior is sunlight sensitivity. All drow, all creatures that live in the Underdark have this. The Orog should have had this. I don't know why they didn't give it to them. Now this definitively tells you these are creatures that do not like sunlight. So if your players cast a spell like daylight, I like to say daylight counts as sunlight because it's literally called daylight. So if they use stuff that produces very bright light from a spell like daylight, they can take advantage of the Orog's weakness, which is their hatred for sunlight. They hate sunlight so much that their skin literally grows blisters from it. So I think that's befitting. Let's get into the actions. This is where the fun stuff comes in. So multi-attack stays the same. They make 2 attacks with these Orogs have Morning Stars or hand axes. The hand axes are supposed to represent throwing axes, but I figured just give them hand axes. Kills 2 birds with 1 stone, lets them attack with something else if they get disarmed of their Morning Star. If they hit with a Morning Star attack, they can make a shield bash attack, but they have to hit with the Morning Star. I see that as like their martial drills. That's how they were trained. Hit with the Morning Star, bash with the shield, hit with the Morning Star, bash with the shield. So let's get into the Orog Morning Star. Orog weapons are very peculiar. They are typically hooked. They have spines on them, and I think that's supposed to mean spines as in like spikes, bony spikes, not spines as in spinal cords. And they also use very, very sharpened weapons. So going forward, if you see anything that says sharp or sharpened, it's going to have a flat +2 to its damage rolls. So for the basic Orog Warrior, I didn't want to make them too complex. So if you're running a group of them, you're not overwhelmed with this creature can do so many things, I don't know what to do. Their basic crush attack with their Morning Star is 2d4 plus 2d4 piercing damage plus 1d4 bludgeoning damage, and if you're a medium or smaller creature that has the capability to bleed, you have to make a DC 14 con save. On a failure, you are bleeding. Now you'll see there's no reminder text here, but I will put on screen what bleeding does. And the reason why I'm removing the reminder text is because I'm doing it to save space on the stat block so that it's not overwhelmingly 4 paragraphs of text to look at. Most of you will memorize what bleeding does after you use this creature for the first couple times anyways, so in the Discord I have a channel that is labeled conditions, and it has all of my conditions for my creature stat blocks going forward on there. I will even take a screenshot and perhaps post the screenshot so you can just take that, download it, keep it as a reference. But bleeding is essentially, it's a dot, and it stacks. So for every stack of bleeding that you have on you, you take 2 points of piercing damage at the end of each of your turns. But if you get magically healed, it stops the bleeding. And if you get a DC 10 medicine check with a healer's kit, it stops the bleeding. Makes sense. The Morning Star is designed to cause piercing wounds on a creature or puncture armor, which leads me to my next attack, Sundering Strike. This is a dangerous ability. This might make some players mad, but I think it's a cool ability. So it just does the strength modifier in terms of damage, because this attack is supposed to attack the creature's armor, not their hit points. So it does 4 piercing damage flat. And then if you're a medium or smaller creature that is wearing medium or heavy armor, or if you're a creature that has thick hide or scales, so if they're living in the Underdark, they're fighting things like hook horrors and whatever other monstrosity that lives down there, this should work on those creatures too. The creature has to make a DC 14 Dex or Strength. It's up to them. On a failure, their AC is reduced by -1, and this is cumulatively, so this stacks. So every time they get hit with this, it's -1, -1, -1, until it is no longer receiving a bonus from that armor. And the penalty lasts until the armor is repaired with mending, or a blacksmith repairs it for you. And if you're a creature that has natural hide and scales, if you take a long rest, your armor regenerates. So gives mending more of a use other than a role-playing device. I think that's a pretty cool thing. If you're if your wizard or your druid has mending, they walk up, they cast mending on you, and your AC goes back to normal. But this is just a way for the Orog to get around creatures that have a 21, 22 AC. I think that's I think that's fair. I mean, mending is a cantrip. It repairs it, you know, with the snap of their finger, an action to repair armor that has a -9 to its AC bonus. I don't think that's that bad. Players are going to hate it. You're going to love it. So, but we're not here to make the players mad. That's why I have the mending in there. So, the second weapon that they have at their disposal are spiked hand axes. So these are hand axes with large spikes that are kind of welded onto the blade itself, so it does slashing and piercing damage. So, you know, if they get disarmed of their Morning Star, somebody melts their Morning Star, does something to the Morning Star, they have a backup weapon. And there's multiple of these because these are used for throwing. These are their ranged weapons. So, you know, you have a slash attack and you have a throw attack. Pretty self-explanatory. Each one does the same damage. You know, the throwing attack has a range of 20 to 60 feet. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Just gives you some more options. Now we have the heavy shield. All the Orog Warriors have one of these. +6 to hit. They can only use this attack in their multi-attack if they hit with the Morning Star. So it's either they use a single shield bash and that's it, or they have to at least land a Morning Star attack. And then they can make 3 attacks total. So if they get hit with this, they take 1d4 bludgeoning damage. If they're medium or smaller, they have to succeed on a DC 14 strength save. On a failure, they're knocked prone. And now we'll go into the bonus actions really quickly. You'll see that aggressive has been moved down here, and I changed it to it's using the dash action. It's not, it moves up to half its, or it doesn't move up to its speed. It takes the dash action. That's what that is. That's an outdated trait that a lot of creatures have. It needed its wording updated, so I took the liberties of doing that. And then we have the spiked plate. It states in their lore that they do have decorative spikes on their plate armor, but I feel like they could probably utilize that some way. So technically, the Orog Warrior can make 4 attacks because it's bonus action slam attack with its plate. I picture this, it's literally shoving its body into you. So it's hockey checking or body checking you, and it only does 1d4 +4 piercing damage. Pretty self-explanatory, pretty cool. I think that more so represents a martial creature than what we had from the 2014 Monster Manual, and that's just the first one. So let's keep moving down the list here and look at the next one that I made. Alright, so this next one is the Orog Warrior Skirmisher. So this is a warrior, but these are skirmishers. So you put these guys up on walls. You could say that these guys go out on hunting expeditions. You know, these are the dudes that fight your hook horrors or your purple worms. Whatever you can think of that makes sense for the Orogs in the Underdark to be using javelins for, that's these guys. The only difference is their AC is much lower, meant to represent that they're not wearing as much armor, so they're more mobile. Their hit points are the same though, so they're still just as hardy. Their just armor class is much lower, making them way easier to hit. They have an athletics skill, and they have a stealth skill. That's another difference that they have. But let's move into the actions here. We have weighted spine javelins, so I picture these actually are carved out of the spine of some Underdark monster, or you could say even they carve out dead slave bodies, and they use these as your throwing javelins. So they're using the bones and the spinal cords of creatures, and then they're doing something to the tips of them to put weight behind it. So you'll see that the stab attack does less damage than the throw attack. That's because when you're throwing it through the air, it's gaining more momentum because of the weight behind it, and I feel like it would deal more damage. So it does a great sword amount of damage per hit with these throwing javelins, so that's pretty scary. But they can also use Tendon Skewer, which is on a hit, it does less damage, so 1d6 piercing damage. Large or smaller creatures are hamstrung, so that is a stacking cumulative -5 to movement speed per stack of hamstrung that you have. But if you receive magical healing or the medicine check, it gets rid of the stacking debuff. So just something that I feel like they would use, like if a prisoner is escaping. Apparently we're not allowed to use the word slave, but I'm gonna say slave. The prisoner slash slave is escaping. They're gonna throw these javelins. They don't want to kill them. They want to just hobble them so they can't get away. And, you know, they get hamstrung from it. Pretty self-explanatory, pretty straightforward. I think it's befitting of them. And then they have a sharpened short sword. This is the first sharpened weapon we're looking at. So flat +2 to the damage, not to the hit. So you'll see it does 1d6 piercing or slashing damage, and it has a +6 instead of a +4 from its strength mod. It's just a backup weapon if they get cornered or they can't throw their javelins, just something that they have. And then we have a reinforced net. This is essentially just a stronger version of the basic 5th edition net. I said larger, smaller creatures are restrained if they get hit with this. They have to use their action to escape, DC 14 strength check, or they can use that to free another creature from the net. If the net is damaged, it has an HP of 5 and an AC of 10, but it is immune to all damage except fire, acid, and slashing. If you do any damage other than slashing, it harms the creature inside for the same damage dealt. So if you cast Fireball, you're going to burn the net off, but you're also going to hurt the wizard, barbarian, bard, rogue, whoever gets caught in this net pretty much will be hurt. And then instead of aggressive, they have cunning action because these are the skirmishers. So they're going to disengage, run backwards, throw their javelins, keeping you in between them space-wise. They're going to space out on you and keep hitting you with these javelins until you can manage to lock them down and beat on them. Might give them a little bit more movement speed, maybe like 35 to 40, just to represent that these are supposed to be the more mobile creatures, but I think cunning action also works. Yeah, so that's your skirmisher, that's your basic ranged unit. Let's move on to the next one. Alright, this is a big boy here. This is the Orog Warrior Shock Trooper, or Shock Troop. So these guys don't have a shield, they still have the spiked plate armor. Everything else is pretty much the same. They do have a new special trait. This is Deep Breaker Charge. So shock troops are supposed to shock and awe the enemy front line or whatever they're fighting. So you could use these guys as guards for the orc chief or whatever you could think of, really. These are just the scary dudes in big armor with large great swords. So they have to move at least 20 feet straight towards the target and hit it with a melee attack. If they do, the target takes an additional 2d4 piercing damage from the Orog's spiked armor slamming into them. So they charge into you, they body slam into you, you get stabbed from the various spikes on their armor. Makes sense. Let's get into their greatsword attack. So these guys have the most amount of things they can do with their singular weapon than the other creatures. So we have a pierce and slash attack, but because this is a hooked greatsword, remember I mentioned that they use hooked weapons in their lore, that's what it states. So they can stab or slash with this, but if they hit something, they may, so they don't have to do this, but they may force the creature, if it's medium or smaller, to make a DC 14 strength save. If it fails, it's moved to an unoccupied space within 5 feet of the Orog. So, you know, the hook grabs onto you and they wrench you around and try to bring you into the middle of the other Orogs behind them, separating the fighter, maybe line of sight wise, so that the clerics can't heal them. That's why these are shock troopers, because they're doing these really brutal tactics. We have Whirling Trip. This is your basic trip attack, so if it hits with this, it does less damage. But if the creature is medium or smaller, it has to make a dex save. If it fails, it falls prone. Now, here's why you can't. You can, but you're disincentivized to spam this against your players. Creatures have advantage on this save if an Orog already attempted to trip it before the start of its next turn. So, Darkest Dungeon style, you catch on if you see something repeatedly using the same move over and over again. So, it's going to be harder and harder after you miss the first time and they succeed the save. They're going to have advantage on the next time you use this. Same thing with this next ability, Disarming Hook. This is something that I kind of stole from my own Hook Horror rework. They can use this. This is sort of Battlemaster Fighter-esque. Medium or smaller creatures holding an object can make a strength save. If they get hit with this attack, on a failure it drops an object of the Orog's choice, and that object lands at its feet, at the creature's feet, not the Orog's. Same thing. If you spam this, it's going to be harder and harder to get that ability off because the creature is learning what the Orog is trying to do, thus disincentivizing you from spamming this and making your players mad. Though you can, it's just going to be a lot harder to do it. And then you have a Pommel Bash. This does 2d4 bludgeoning damage, and the creature has to make a con save. On a failure, it's dazed 2, so it gets 2 stacks of dazed. And I will put on screen what dazed does so you can pause and read it for yourself. Okay, let's move on to the spiked hand axes. Same thing as the regular warrior. They have just something that they can use for ranged damage up to 60 feet. It's at disadvantage if it's beyond 20 feet. Same thing, pretty self-explanatory. And then they have the same bonus actions as the Orog Warrior. So that is your Shock Trooper. Let's move on to the next Orog. Alright, here's a unique Orog here. We're coming away from the Warriors now, and we're looking at this creature is an Orog Everwatcher. Now this Orog is essentially an Orog Eye of Grumsh. However, this is lore-wise, this is what these creatures would actually be called. They'd be called Everwatchers if they were high-ranking members or priests of Grumsh. So this creature, you're going to see immediately its hit points are higher. They have an additional hit die worth of health. They have a saving throw proficiency in Wisdom. And that's it for that. Their challenge rating has gone up to 4 now, so that's a lot more deadly. We do start to see some similarities with the Eye of Grumsh. They have Grumsh's Fury, so their weapon attacks deal an additional 1d8 damage. It's already included, so that's just there to remind you where that extra damage is coming from. We have Vengeance of the One Eye. This is a cool ability. I kind of stole this from Warhammer Total War. The Slayer dwarves have this, but somebody else kind of did this before on a Homebrew creature stat block. I remember seeing a long time ago. I might have seen it in a Kobold press book too, but this is Vengeance of the One Eye. The One Eye is another name for Grumsh, if you don't know. When this orc is reduced to 0 hit points, it makes a melee attack against a hostile creature within range before it dies or it falls unconscious. So it gets one last hit in before it goes down. And then this one has Channel Divinity. This is another ability. It's only once per day, but it can add +10 to an attack roll after seeing the roll, but before knowing if it hits or misses. Just kind of shows that it's a cleric, so it has a Channel Divinity with its cleric, and that is a War Domain Channel Divinity because Grumsh is part of the War Domain Pantheon. Now we'll get into the actions here. They do have spell casting, and you'll see that I have spell casting under actions because they cast spells as an action. This is what the newer editions of D&D are doing. I agree with the spell casting being under the actions. So you'll just see, they have 3 cantrips. These are once a day abilities though, however, or not once a day. These are daily abilities rather than spell slots, so you don't have to keep track of spell slots. This will make them a lot stronger, but that's why I have their challenge rating up to 4. So they can cast Cure Wounds 3 times a day, Inflict Wounds 3 times a day, or Sanctuary 3 times a day. They can cast Hold Person twice a day, and Magic Weapon twice a day. They have Spirit Guardians. Spirit Guardians is going to make them very dangerous. That's a very strong spell for clerics. Dungeon Masters, you probably know, that is an annoying spell to deal with as a Dungeon Master, but now we're putting it on our monsters, so the players can deal with it too. Let's get into the Bloody Hooked Spear. The Bloody Spear is a Grumsh weapon specifically, so I wanted to just give them the flavor of having a quote-unquote Bloody Hooked Spear because Orogs use hooked weapons, sharpened weapons, and weapons with spines. So this is a cool weapon. So they have just a regular stab attack that has that same ability as the great sword that the shock trooper had, so they can forcefully move a creature if they hit. But these creatures don't have multi-attack. Keep that in mind. So the basic stab attack has that. Now, hook and twist. This is a brutal move here. So if they hit a medium or smaller creature with this, that creature has to make a strength save. If they fail, they are grappled. While they're grappled this way, the creature takes 3d8 piercing damage at the start of each of its turns, and then the Orog can only use its stab action on the grappled creature while maintaining this grapple. So he literally hooks that hooked spear into you and he twists it, and then you start just taking damage as it's ripping your insides apart. That's a pretty brutal thing that I could picture an orc doing to somebody, so that's befitting. Now, here's a special thing that I got out of Grummish's lore. I looked through it and I said, why can't clerics of Grummish use an ability like this? So this is Grummish's Putrid Shroud, and this requires concentration, but they have this at all times, so there's no limit on how many times they can do this, but it is concentration. So the Orog conjures a cloud of thick black smoke in a 20-foot radius centered on itself. The cloud moves with the Orog and it lasts for 1 minute. So that area would be obscured. Creatures of the Orog's choice, so this doesn't affect its allies unless it wants it to, that enter the cloud or they start there must make a DC 14 con save. If they fail, they take 5d8 poison damage, and this is even if the creature doesn't breathe, it still takes this damage. The smoke spreads around corners and it heavily obscures the area, but if you use something with strong wind, it disperses the smoke and it ends the effect. So that's Cloud Kill on an ability that has no limit, but of course this creature doesn't have multi-attack, so it's either going to do that, and then if you hit it and it drops concentration, it just wasted its turn doing that. But that's a pretty decent amount of damage. That's going to make these guys a lot scarier. Now, if they hook and twist you and then they cast Grummish's Putrid Shroud, that's going to do a lot. That's a ton of damage, but it takes time to set that up. At any point in time, they could, slay this Everwatcher, knock him down, make him drop concentration. Just a strong ability on a creature that's got much slower action economy. I think it's befitting. It kind of makes them unique. So that's the Everwatcher. Let's keep going because we're not done yet. Alright, second to last guy here. Let's look at the Deep Warden. This is an Orog Warrior, so we're going back to the Warrior. However, this guy is a walking fortress, an absolute unit of an Orog. These are your guards for the city in the Underdark. These guys have to be prepared to fight anything. Purple worms, hook horrors, bullays. There's anything that is a large, scary monster. These guys got to be prepared for it. So their armor class is 22. That's a lot of AC, and they have a tower shield, but they don't have spiked plate armor, you'll see. So they do have a saving throw proficiency in Constitution. They have a stealth saving throw proficiency. I gotta remove that. That was a mistake on my part, keeping that in there. I think I copied it from another one of my orcs. You'll see coming down to the special traits here, he has a special trait called Walking Fortress. He has advantage on saving throws against being moved, knocked prone, grappled, or restrained. He has the Sentinel feat. That's a pretty dangerous one, so whenever a creature within 5 feet of him makes an attack against a target other than itself, the Orog can make a melee attack against that creature. Creatures hit by the Orog's opportunity attacks have their speed reduced to 0 for the rest of its turn. So the Sentinel feat is just on the creature. That's actually supposed to say it makes an opportunity attack. So we also have Phalanx Stance. So this is a Greek battle tactic here. At the start of the Orog's turn, it can sacrifice all of its movement and it enters a defensive stance until the start of its next turn. While in this stance, creatures provoke attacks of opportunity from the Orog when they enter its reach with its spear, and then it cannot take the dash action while in this stance. I might give it something that gives it
you know, maybe +2 to its armor class, an advantage on some other save, while it has the Phalanx stance, because it says it's a defensive stance, so it should probably have something like a cover bonus or something like that, but pretty strong. I think that's befitting. We'll get into the actions. We'll skim over these because nothing too much has changed here. So they have a hooked spear, much like the Grumish cleric that we just looked at. They have sweeping hook on their spear, but they do still have hook and twist, and they have multi-attack, so they can hook and twist and stab on the same turn, which is pretty deadly. They have the sweeping hook attack, which is just a way for them to knock a creature prone. You know, these are just maybe more martially trained than the clerics, but, you know, they have a way to knock large or smaller creatures prone, so they can trip up much larger creatures now, so they can trip hook horrors and things like that. They have their spiked hand axes, so they have a ranged attack. Now their tower shield attack is pretty interesting. So this is a D8 bludgeoning damage on a hit. It doesn't knock you prone, but it does shove you away if you fail the strength check, and you get pushed back 10 feet. If you get pushed back into a wall or another creature, you take an additional 1d6 bludgeoning damage, and then the creature that you get slammed into also takes 1d6 bludgeoning damage. And then they also have aggressive. You'll also notice that the speed on these guys is much slower, and their dexterity score is much lower. So they're supposed to be the bulky Black Iron Tarkus from Dark Souls-esque character if you've ever played Dark Souls. These are the bulky walking fortress of a creature. But we're not done yet. We still have one more guy to look at here. So let's get into him. Alright, here we go. So this is the Orog War Chief. Can't do orcs without a War Chief. Now this is an Orog War Chief, so going down through his stat block here, he has purple worm scale armor, so that shows that he has slain a purple worm at some point in his life. I think that kind of just shows you a bit more, oh, this guy is serious, he means business. And this could be a female too. If you want to have a female war chief, I just use he as the descriptor, but these could be female. I don't see why they couldn't. 102 hit points, so this is supposed to be an elite boss mob at the least, pretty much a boss fight. It's never going to be alone. You're going to throw this in with other Orogs around it, or orcs. Saving throws across the board: strength save, con save, wisdom save, charisma save proficiencies, athletics, intimidation are pretty high. He has a damage resistance to acid because of the purple worm scale armor. Now, purple worms don't have acid resistance normally, but I just wanted to give him something, you know, something that represents he's wearing purple worm scale armor. So if a player character slays the Orog War Chief, he could take his armor. He has purple worm scale armor that gives him 18 AC and acid resistance. Same dark vision, challenge rating 8 on this guy. We'll get into its special traits. Pretty self-explanatory. I wanted to kind of leave this easier to run because you're going to be running these in hordes more than likely. Multiple guys at a time fighting you. So Brute, that's going to be the first one. That's going to, yeah, he's going to do a lot of damage on a hit. So his melee attacks deal an additional damage die worth of damage on a hit. He has Brave, so he has advantage on saving throws against being frightened, and he has Reckless, so he can have advantage on all melee attack rolls. However, when he uses this, all attack rolls against him have advantage until the start of his next turn. So he's gonna hit a lot with Reckless. Let's get into the multi-attack. He makes 3 attacks instead of 2. Either with his Great Morningstar or his hand axes, but he can also replace an attack with Commander's Strike, which is a recharge ability, but we'll get into that. So let's look at the Great Morningstar. This is a guy that's going to be putting up a fight for any creature or character in your player character's party. So The first attack for the Great Morningstar, which by the way has a +9 to hit, so that's nothing to scoff at. It does 2d8 piercing damage plus 2d4 bludgeoning damage, so that's already getting hit by a truck. Essentially, for a creature of his size, that's a lot of damage. Larger, smaller creatures that can bleed are bleeding too, so they get 2 stacks of bleeding, which would mean per stack of bleeding you take 2 points of damage at the end of each of your turns, so they're taking 4 points of bleeding every time they get hit with this until they take magical healing. So that is deadly. You go down and you have that bleeding dot on you, that's going to cause you to constantly fail your death saves. Even if you succeed, it happens at the end of your turn, but you know, you get pinged for that 4 damage, pinged for that 4 damage. If he hits you 3 times, that's 4, 8, 12 damage at the end of each of your turns. And then if his next turn comes around and he hits you 3 more times, that's 2, 4, 6 more points of damage. So yeah, nothing to scoff at. That's dangerous. Thunderous Smash. If you are a larger, smaller creature and you get hit with this, you have to make a DC 17 con save. If you fail, you are stunned. But, as always, you're disincentivized to spam this because creatures have advantage on this save if an Orog already attempted to stun it before the start of its next turn. So in theory, he could stun 3 separate creatures if he used his multi-attack and did 3 thunderous smashes, which makes him scary. It shows that he's this powerful badass, and you know, it's just part of the fight. It's just part of his mechanics. You can take that out if you don't like it, but that's what I thought would be befitting of an Orc War Chief. You know, he's got 22 strength. That's a lot. Sundering Smash is similar to the regular Orog Warrior's Morningstar, except this is a -2 cumulative penalty to armor class bonus. So he's going to really ruin your armor, and he actually does a d8 instead of just his strength damage for this, so pretty deadly. He has spiked hand axes, so that hasn't changed, and then his commander strike states, on a recharge, I might take the recharge out and just let him use it freely, because it's really not that much of a difference in terms of if he attacks or if he makes his creatures attack for him, but it depends on what you give him. So he can direct a friendly creature that he can see that can hear him to use its reaction to make a weapon attack. So if he has a purple worm pet, he can use Commander Strike and make that purple worm make an attack action. So that's pretty deadly. It's simplistic, but it's brute force. So easy to run, very scary if you come into contact with it. Now this one bonus action is pretty dangerous here, and I think I want to give more orcs this. So this is Brutal Execution. So what this does, he makes a melee attack against a creature that is at 0 HP unconscious. So if your player character is making death saves, he can make a melee attack as a bonus action. If he hits, all allies that witnessed him hitting that creature with this attack has to make a DC 17 wisdom save. On a failure, they are frightened for 1 minute, and they can repeat the save at the end of each of their turns, but that save is made at disadvantage if the Orog is within line of sight. So if you go down in front of him, he's going to make an example out of you and cause all of his men to cheer, and you are going to be frightened. So this is probably something he's using on the battlefield, right? He's an Orc War Chief. He's brutal. He is reckless abandon incarnate. So that's going to do it for my Orog rework. If you are a Patreon subscriber, you do gain access to 5 additional stat blocks that I've spent time making as a thank you for supporting me. But if you have any suggestions for other variant stat blocks, please leave them down in the comments below. I love reading your comments. I love to take ideas that people give me and toss out, and maybe you're going to help somebody else with one of your ideas. You never know who's going to read these comments. So I'm DM Dungeon Mastery. Thank you for the patience. It took me a little bit to make this video because I had to rework these creatures from scratch, but this is why I wanted to do humanoids, because they're so versatile. You can give them anything that makes sense for a humanoid to have in their stat block. Just having fun with making these creature reworks for you guys, and yeah, this is DM Dungeon Mastery signing out. I will see you in the next one. Thank you very much.